In the dim light of a museum cabinet, a small cloth doll sits motionless, its painted smile forever stitched into a century-old innocence. To a casual observer, it is merely a toy. To believers, historians of the uncanny, and those who consume stories of the supernatural, it is a household name steeped in dread, Annabelle. But the doll that rattles the imagination in the cinema is not the doll that, for decades, sat quietly behind glass. The difference between Hollywood's lacquered nightmare and the simple, rag-stuffed artifact preserved in a New England collection reveals as much about storytelling as it does about fear itself. This documentary is not an attempt to prove the supernatural. Instead, it is an exploration of how an ordinary object, a child's rag doll, was transformed into an enduring modern myth. It traces the path from a quiet bedside companion to a silver screen antagonist and asks why we need it. A monster to wear the face of a child's plaything. The story begins not in a haunted house, but in a rented apartment in the 1970s. According to accounts that would ripple across tabloids and eventually into textbooks of pop culture, two young women shared a small flat in a college town. They told friends that their Raggedy Ann doll, gifted to them, behaved strangely. Notes would appear around the apartment, scrawled messages in a childlike hand. The doll seemed to move from room to room without explanation. A local psychic, or, depending on which telling you pick, a neighbor with strange instincts, suggested that the toy might be more than an innocent plaything. When the occurrences escalated, the women sought help. Their story found its way to a pair of investigators who were then approaching national notoriety, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens professed to study and contain objects and places they believed were imbued with malignant forces. In their care, many artifacts were cataloged and stored, each with its own cautionary label. One of these items, the Raggedy Ann doll from the apartment, would become by far the most famous. Yet even here the narrative forks. The couple who donated the doll to the Warrens painted a picture of a toy that had been the conduit for inexplicable happenings. The Warrens, in turn, framed the doll as inhabited by a spirit that had attached itself, first to notes in small mischief, then to more aggressive portents. The melancholic truth is that the doll itself was unremarkable. A soft-bodied, slightly worn Raggedy Ann, with yarn hair and a hand-stitched smile. It was, in form and function, the sort of object that had comforted generations of children. Its power, then, was not in its materials, but in the narrative that accreted around it. By the time Hollywood took notice, the story had evolved. Horror cinema thrives on identifiable icons. Names like Dracula and Frankenstein conjure not only characters, but also years of cultural baggage. For a modern horror franchise, a doll offered an unfussy pathway to intimacy and terror. Intimate, because dolls are associated with home and childhood. Terrifying, because they distort what is supposed to be safe. Filmmakers saw potential in Annabelle, but the visual language of the big screen demanded a design that could read clearly in dark theaters and promotional posters. The result was an aesthetic departure. The silver screen Annabelle is a composite of archetypal fears: pale porcelain skin, glassy eyes, and a mouth capable of an expression more sinister than sewn thread can achieve. Directors and art departments do not merely design monsters. They manufacture emotional shorthand. The movie doll would be crafted to provoke instantaneous unease. The real Raggedy Ann's quirkier, gentler features would risk eliciting nostalgia rather than fear. Producers were reportedly wary, according to interviews and behind-the-scenes accounts, that recreating the actual Raggedy Ann would fail to frighten audiences, and, worse, might even provoke a spike of public fascination that could distract from the film's crafted dilemma. There is also perhaps a deeper anxiety at play. Some fear that giving the real object center stage risks legitimizing the story in ways the filmmakers do not control. It is easier and safer for a film's mythology to invent a face for terror than to use the true face of an artifact whose provenance carries complex and contested claims. So the cinematic Annabelle was born. A porcelain-skinned simulacrum, elegant and eerie, designed to inhabit an invented narrative that intersected with the Warrens' cataloged horrors. The film's success seeded a new, amplified layer of myth. Moviegoers, citing trailers and posters, frequently assumed the uncanny doll on screen was the very one kept in a museum case. Social media accelerated this confusion. Still images of the cinematic Annabelle circulated alongside photographs of the museum's Raggedy Ann. The internet did the rest, blending fiction and fact into a single stream, where distinctions become optional. Meanwhile, the real doll's custodian, the Warrens' occult museum, embraced the new attention. In a climate where the macabre sells and legends draw visitors, items like the Raggedy Ann took on an almost curatorial role. The museum became a shrine to anomalies. An old Ouija board, smudged photographs, and the cloth doll, each labeled with the Warrens' stern admonitions. For skeptics, the museum was a curiosity cabinet, a place where personal testimony met theatrical display. For believers, it was a place of containment where dangerous objects were kept from the public until they could be neutralized or studied. Yet being behind glass did not mute the tales. Visitors claimed that the doll's presence carried a chill, that photographs taken nearby would develop anomalies, that caretakers would feel scraped fingertips in the dark. Storytellers favor concrete detail, and the Raggedy Ann supplied it. A frayed seam, a repair on its left hip, the yellowing of fabric where a child's thumb had rubbed for years. Each abrasion became a possible conduit for narrative, an invitation for the imagination to fill in the gaps. The tension between the doll's harmless materiality and the sinister acts attributed to it sharpened the story. It also revealed predictable human instinct. When faced with the unknown, we prefer narrative to ambiguity. The cinema amplified, stylized, and universalized the tale. In films, movement is proof. An object that moves on screen is incontrovertible evidence of agency. A doll turning its head, the tilt of its painted smile in a flicker of light. These things are explicit, undeniable in the medium of motion. In real life, such claims depend on testimony and interpretation. The filmmakers, in choosing to dramatize, made choices that favored spectacle over subtlety. That decision rewired the public's memory of the original artifact. Now, for many, the Annabelle behind glass is expected to resemble its cinematic avatar. When the museum doll does not look like that, the mismatch is itself instructive. What frightens us in film is often an amplified version of what unsettles us in life. The cultural life of Annabelle also raises questions about authorship. Who owns a story once it is told? The women who first reported the doll's strange behavior, the Warrens who cataloged it, the filmmakers who fictionalized it, and the audiences who consumed and reshaped the narrative, all had stakes in how the doll would be remembered. Each retelling added brushstrokes, embellishment here, simplification there. The cumulative effect was the creation of a mythic object that is at once more and less than the original, more in its cultural saturation and less in its factual fidelity. Is another, quieter moral here about how we anthropomorphize objects. Human beings are pattern-seeking machines. We read intent into randomness and motive into coincidence. A child's toy sits in a darkened room, and our minds, primed by stories and fears, begin to project. This predilection is not merely a cognitive quirk. It is also the engine of folklore and religion. Objects become talismans, scapegoats, or saints, depending on the stories we tell about them. In the final analysis, the tale of Annabelle is a mirror. On one side sits a simple Raggedy Ann, soft, sewn, and undeniably human-made. On the other sits a world that needs monsters to define itself. Whether you believe the doll to be truly possessed, or whether you see in it the fertile ground of myth-making, the outcome remains the same. Annabelle, in both incarnations, tells us about our hunger for narrative, our fear of the domestic, turned hostile, and our deep, sometimes irrational, wish to find meaning in littlest objects. The doll behind the glass will remain a doll, a stitched mouth, a patch of faded fabric where a child once rested its chin, an anonymous object that became famous. The cinema's Annabelle will continue to stalk the screen, perfect in her porcelain horror. Both will travel side by side in public imagination, one the repository of testimony, and the other the emblem of terror. And somewhere in the fading hum of a climate-controlled display case, if you stand very still and imagine hard enough, you might hear the whisper that makes the story survive, the soft rustle of cloth, a remembered voice calling a name that will not be forgotten.